So lay people now use terms like chemical imbalance to explain mental illness, and we have no evidence that chemical imbalance causes mental illness. There are no objective tests for mental illness. People talk about Katrina brain to describe their responses to natural disaster. They talk about a dopamine hit to refer to pleasurable experiences. So people love now the biological explanations for mental illness. So you had Christine Blasey Ford in the Brett Kavanaugh hearings in 2018. She asserted that 30-year-old memories of his sexual assault were indelible in the hippocampus, and genes have become consumer commodities. Millions of individuals use 23andMe and the like to sequence their genomes and to assess their chances of developing various diseases, including mental disorders. So this information becomes an integral part of the way they understand themselves and their experiences. So for the past 40 years, the road to salvation in the dominant zeitgeist is through biological psychiatry, through neuroscience, and through genetics. So supposedly neuroscience is going to show us the way to salvation. We're going to be able to image and sequence what's going on in the brain, and we're going to have unprecedented new understandings about mental disorders. And most mental illness research is based on the DSM classifications, that these diagnostic and statistical manual from the Psychiatric Association, which dominates all mental health classifications, is being taken for granted by researchers that these DSM classifications accurately reflect underlying brain and genetic states. But the DSM revolution and its symptom-based diagnoses, so there are no objective tests of mental health. So diagnoses since DSM-3 have been based on symptoms, and these things, DSM and symptom-based diagnosis, turned out to be millstones for the neurobiological study of mental illness, because DSM categories like narcissistic personality disorder or bipolar disorder turns out to have no actual reality. It's just a billing system for dealing with insurance. So if we want to understand the biological underpinnings of mental disorders, we not only need to know about genes, about neurotransmitters, neurochemicals, but we also need a clear idea of what condition embedded in the brain is being genetically transmitted. So the part played by heredity in the development of mental illness continues to be completely unsolved. Right? We don't know which genes exactly cause mental illness. And the chief difficulty to figure this out is to define the condition, the heredity of which one is attempting to trace. So all our DSM diagnoses, they're simply a way to get insurance billing for insurance billing purposes and to prescribe medication. They're not particularly helpful in working with reality. So I remember when I'd have therapy, my therapist says, look, I have to diagnose you to be able to bill insurance for what we're doing. So it's these DSM classifications of mental disorders that have played this huge role in studies of mental disorders, completely contrary to other medical conditions, because other medical conditions are objective tests, but there are no objective tests for mental disorders. It's just based on the clinician's observation, opinions, and your own self-reporting. So the patient's self-description and the doctor's observation, these are the only tools available for confirming the existence of some mental illness. So the DSM has essentially been the sole resource that neuroscientists have possessed to define the condition that they're studying. So genetic researchers in the 1980s and 1990s, they expected to find the gene or the genes that predicted the emergence of various DSM disorders. But DSM diagnoses don't correspond to any particular genotype. So neurobiological researchers have been on a fruitless search for underlying causal processes that simply don't exist in nature. So we have no reason to believe, after 40 plus years of research, that DSM categories have discrete underlying biological causes. Instead, they indicate the very opposite. The DSM diagnoses are extraordinarily heterogeneous, meaning they're highly overlapping with other entities. They are more continuous than categorical. So categorical means either or. Continuous means varying levels. And they share common rather than specific vulnerabilities. So there are no genetic associations at all with major depressive disorder or anorexia that have yet been discovered. So to the extent the mental disorders are inheritable, they arise from complex interactions among many genes with very weak cumulative influences. So we do not have and are not likely to ever discover genes for psychiatric illnesses. This is the most important and the most discouraging discovery in the history of psychiatry, according to one psychiatrist, Randolph Ness. So major depressive disorder, which is the most popular diagnostic category in psychiatry, is not a single entity, right? So what the DSM calls major depressive disorder is an unknown number of diverse conditions. So people with the diagnosis major depression have all these different disease states mediated by very different underlying pathophysiological mechanisms. We have no variable that defines a more heritable or genetically homogeneous subtype of depression. There's no clinician, no researcher who believes that major depressive disorder is a single illness. Despite more than 2 decades of sustained investment in psychiatric neuroscience, the fundamental pathology underlying depression remains elusive, and the diagnostic criteria for depression remains descriptive in nature, meaning depression is an absolutely adaptive and appropriate response to certain circumstances, right? Depression, the shift since DSM-3, since 1980, is to look at these diagnostic categories, these diagnosing of pathology outside the context of a person's life, which is insane, right? In certain contexts, you'd be crazy not to be depressed. In other contexts, you'd be crazy not to be anxious, right? In other contexts, you'd be crazy not to be ecstatic. In other contexts, you'd be crazy not to feel low, right? But the way psychiatry has worked since 1980 in the DSM-3 is to make these diagnoses without reference to your context. There's one major exception to this, and that's PTSD. So PTSD is entirely culturally derived diagnosis. It doesn't relate to any particular symptoms. It can't be diagnosed based on certain symptoms. Luke's got the audience he deserves. I'd like Luke to speak about live stream chat when he sees some of us. Is there an eye roll of contempt, a sigh, a prayer for a better crowd? I get the crowd I deserve. Now, obviously, I like some people better than others, but that also varies by the day. Mr. White Male says there's a funny moment on Dr. Katz where a patient says he needs a diagnosis or insurance won't pay, and Laura asks, how about borderline personality? I wonder if we could trace common money sources between the committees of experts that write and update the DSM and Big Pharma. Yes, virtually everyone who contributes to the DSM is on Big Pharma's payroll. Everyone meaning 2/3, and in some categories it's like 80%.